so that's all that I have in terms of the workshop today. But if you guys have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them about like things that I already talked about, or things that I haven't talked about, but you have questions about relating to analysis and strategy. I'm also gonna link the presentation to you all in case you want to practice emotions. Yeah, copy link, so I'll send that on chat. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. If you have any questions, feel free to either raise your voice or ask them on the chat.
Actually, just to ask one question in the chat.
Go for it. Oh yeah. Oh, I see them. Okay, so question. Do the impacts come at the end of each reason or after I give all three reasons? I would definitely do them at the end of all three reasons. So I think that the overall structure of your speech should be firstly the premise of your argument, then after that, reasons why the premise is true, if you're doing that structure, and then after that, what is the impact of your reason being true, essentially. And then after that, why is that more important than other stuff in the debate? So what that would look like in, for example, I and the Skype policing debate. Okay, what I'm going to show in this argument is why it is that this will significantly reduce crime. I have three reasons why. First reason, second reason, third reason. And obviously, like, these are long sentences, right? You want to explain them. The reason why this is so important is, so that's your impact. And this is more important than the privacy argument that the op is very likely to run in this debate because. So as you see, that's, again, it's kind of like a generic structure, right? There's like reason, or rather argument, three reasons why argument is true. This is important because this is more important than what the op says because bam. So you basically just need to fill it in. And I think getting used to doing that each debate is helpful. So yeah, I would definitely do it at the end. As the second speaker, is it best to leave the like why we win at the end of your speech? Yeah, I think probably as a second speaker, that's good. At least I like doing that. Like, so for example, I think in deputies, or I think probably in whips, so I think as a first speaker, it's really nice to have at the start of your speech, sort of like, what is your case? Why do you win? I think that should happen in PM. I think that should happen in LO. And I think in extension, the best way to start an extension speech is to be like, here's what has happened so far. Here is what our extension is. And here is why our extension is going to win us the debate. So really quickly, because I think in extension, you very frequently get sort of like, oh, like you had some good analysis, I just didn't get what your extension was. And that's fair, like it's very common because frequently extensions are very nuanced and therefore difficult to distinguish from the top half debate. So I think just immediately starting by the debate in top half has been about X. Here's what our extension is. So the judge immediately knows. And the reason why our extension is going to win us around is the following. So yeah, so that's a really good thing that you can do. But I think for second speakers, to answer that question, I think that it's important to kind of do it at the end of the speech, or at least at the end of each like clash. So if you're a web speaker, I think a way that I like doing structure, or that you might see people do structure, is either going team by team, or going like by clashes, like what are things that people have talked about and why we win them. So I think that you want to do sort of that, why have we won? What is our narrative? At the end of each of those things. So first versus OG, why do we beat OG? Just in a sentence, really quick. Why do we beat them? Really easy, very simple. Why do we beat CG? Why do we win or bench? But I think that also when you're doing clashes, you also want to do that at the end of each clash, right? Like, why have we won this clash? Really easy in a sentence. And I think that the projection of that narrative, like I do clash structure. I'm not very good at like the team by team one, but there's obviously some very good speakers who are very good at that. But when you do clashes, I think it's quite nice that it also creates a narrative, because at the end of your speech, you can be like, we have shown you these three things that you won the clashes, basically. So the judge is like, yeah, they showed those three things, therefore they win. So yeah, but I think it obviously just depends on your style, but I think it's good to do like across. What's your strategy when you're a closing team and you have a strong opening that's winning the debate and the other side don't have a strong case, didn't respond properly to your opening? I think if that's the situation, that your opening is just awesome, you want to cut your losses and be like, you know what, partner, we may take a second in this round. That's completely fine. Even if you're in like, unless you're in a final, in which case, you know, we can't all win everything. If you're in even like a quarterfinal or a semifinal, you don't need to beat your opening. You just need to take the second to your opening. So in that case, I think you just need to be very strategic about how you go in and just be like, panel, what I'm going to show you is that the opposition has no case in this round, and just make sure that you win that. So obviously, like it'd be great if we could win everything, but we can't. So I think you have to be realistic about that. A piece of advice that I really like is like, obviously winning is really good, but the main thing that you want to do to like do very well at a tournament is to not fourth, because fourthing is like, it's quite hurtful, like you gain no points, whereas if you take a third you gain like 1 point. If you take a second, also quite a good result. If you win, obviously best result. But so I think that sometimes what you want to do, and this is the advice that I got, is like kick the weaker leg. Just pick one team and explain why it doesn't matter what the other two teams did, you absolutely definitely just beat this one team. Like this one team is worse than you, they should take the fourth. So I think that's a useful thing to prioritize. So I think when you're in a closing team and you have a very strong opening, I think what you want to do is to like tie yourself to that opening team and be like, look, government bench just has taken this round. Obviously my partner has added some new things, and you don't want to like not add anything, because then judges will be like, you didn't have an extension, therefore we put you fourth. But you can show via responses that the other side doesn't have anything, and then like my partner added some really valuable, useful things. So basically, can't win everything. Sometimes taking a second is completely fine. Strategy-wise, how hardcore should I be when facing burdens in prep? For instance, in the Zeus motion, how advisable is it in terms of a strategy to try and go around some things I know oppositions will bring up? If I say, yeah, here's a model, we'll keep animals that were raised in zoos living there till they die, which can be 30 years from now, we just won't accept new ones and close the zoos where these animals eventually die out. What's the line between strategy and bad sportsmanship or shying away from burdens here and in similar situations? That's a very fair question, and obviously it's something that a lot of teams struggle with. It's like known as like squirreling the motion, when you're doing the motion kind of, but you're also basically doing a very convoluted model that gets away from a lot of stuff. I think that the main thing that I would say is just obviously I think obviously sometimes like running good things is good, like cool things in your model, but I think that there's two problems with it oftentimes. One is that they get really fucking complicated, and that's not a thing you want, because then judges are like, you had like a 5-minute model, it was really hard to follow, and you had no real arguments for why you should do the thing, you just have a very long model. But second is that also when you reduce the other side's harms, you also reduce their benefit, you also reduce your own benefits. Because you reduce the capacity of your case to have an impact. So for example, in this model, I actually think this model is probably fine to just be like, current animals, we will just keep until they die, we just won't take new ones, because you are in the end banning zoos. But even here, it's like, okay, but if the opposition argues that then if you really believe that like there's a huge benefit from those animals being in the wild, then the fact that you aren't releasing these animals kind of like curbs your benefits in some way. I think that the line between strategy and bad sportsmanship is quite, iffy. So you have to kind of trust your gut on it. But I think that the main thing that I would say in terms of like one thing that this question does bring up is I think it's actually quite important to think about what the other side will say in prep. If you think about what I said about weighing, about how you want to always be like, okay, here's why my argument is more important than what the other side is arguing for. That's obviously very easy to do if the other side already has spoken and already has arguments. But what if you're PM? And I think that here is the thing. When you know that the other side is probably going to run an argument because you discussed it in prep, you can integrate that into your argument. So even from PM, you can stand up with your like, crime is good. Sorry, we reduce crime is bad argument, and be like, okay, so we reduce crime, 3 reasons why this is important. This is more important than what the opposition is likely to say. Look, the op will stand up here and tell you that privacy is being violated, but we still think that this is the most important argument in the round because blah, 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 blah. Because then you're preempting their argument, and it means that the other side has to respond to your preemption or they're not winning. So I think that thinking about what the other side will say and try to integrate that into your case is also a very useful thing to do in opening government that very frequently people don't do or don't realize. Yeah, so any other questions? Hopefully that was like reasonably clear. Yeah, go for it.
I want to know if you think that is more helpful in prep time. We come up with arguments and evidence with our partner, like say the arguments and we have to prove for this and like be very clear about it, or is better to just define the debate, like say what is the status quo, what is the burdens, what is the metrics, and come with the arguments individual, and especially when you are closing positions?
So obviously it differs depending on your partner, and I think that it's important to like discuss what the preferences of the partner are. I think normally you should prioritize more like what the first speaker wants to do, because obviously they're the one who wants to speak first. So for example, when I'm speaking in OG, I have partners that want to do the first thing that you mentioned, that really want to sort of like talk through all of the arguments individually in detail, because that's what helps them write it down. I've also had partners who really don't like that and who are like, nope, at 10 minutes, I would just go write my case. You can leave me alone and think about like responses. I don't care, just leave me alone to write, because I can't like talk and write at the same time. So I think it's important to talk through what you each find useful. I think that normally you would, or at least as a general rule, I think that normally you want to do brainstorm on your own first. So try to come up with arguments first. The only situation in which you don't is when the motion is like really weird and you're like, I don't know what this means. In which case, I think you want to do the other thing. So that's sort of like, before we start brainstorming, can we just make sure that the motion, like we are clear on what the motion is asking us to do? You discuss it really quickly, you decide, and then you're like, okay, now individual prep. And then you do that. After that, I think that in top half, you normally would want to go through the case and be like, here's the arguments, therefore, how do we make our case? I think in back half, that changes quite a lot. I think in back half, you maybe want slightly longer individual prep, because what you want to be thinking in back half is as many arguments as you can, as weird as it can get. In top half, you're thinking, what's the obvious best case? In back half, you want to think as many arguments as you want. And then once you've done that, what you want to think about is which of these arguments are so obvious that the top half is definitely going to run them. If you can't come up with like any other arguments that you think aren't obvious but also aren't good, then what you should discuss in prep is, okay, so these are the obvious arguments. What bits of these arguments do you think prop or top half is unlikely to run very well, so that you can still have stuff that you can add, and then you can discuss more in detail that thing. I think it's very bad as an idea to just go into the debate as a back half team already with a case prepared, because it will change massively depending on what the debate looks like and what your top half runs. I think that instead what you want to go into is with like several different potential plans. So like, okay, there's like 4 arguments that we could potentially run and one like extra analysis extension that we could add to this obvious thing. And then at some point, just make sure that you and your partner have a way to agree on what the case you're running is. So like in online debating, obviously your partner can just write you and be like, okay, I listened to the Prime Minister and I listened to Deputy PM. So these are the 2 arguments that I'm running out of the 4 that we discussed. And then you can be as a whip like, yeah, okay. So I think that's the best way to do it. Because I think otherwise, like it happened to me because I got very nervous about extension when I started. I now whip, but I used to extend. When I extended, I'd always like go in with like my little extension written down and I'd write it during the debate, and then the deputy would say it, and I'm like, oh no. So obviously, I think instead what you want to do is like just chill out. Like PM has to write it in 15 minutes, so can you, and just come up with like kind of broad ideas, and then you can follow any of them depending on how the debate goes. So that would be my advice for back half prep. Any specific strategy for a prep time sheet? Yeah, so I know that some people find it very helpful. So I think that overall the main things that I would say for a prep time sheet are, firstly, I think something that's very helpful when you're improving as a speaker is to come up with some things that you think you're not that good at. I think people very frequently mess up when they do this is they come up with like 50 things that they're bad at. And it's like, yeah, because like you're starting out, you're like still improving. There's obviously some things that aren't great, but when you come up with 50, you're not going to get good at any of them because you try to focus on all of them at the same time. I think you should make like a relatively short list, right? Like here's like 5 things that I think just I need to improve on. So for example, when I was trying to like being competitive as a speaker, I thought that one of the big things that I wanted to improve on was my analysis. So I was like, okay, I'm very good at coming up with like the story, but I'm quite bad at giving individual reasons for that story. So I want to get better at that. So then I wrote at the top of like my prep sheet, I guess, or like my prep notebook, I was like, come up with reasons. So every debate I would go in and look at it and be like, I have this visual reminder that that's what I need to do. And sometimes what I would also do is I would ask the judge at the end of the debate, like if there's like one thing that you say I needed to improve from that speech, what would that be? And then I would write it down. And then the next debate, I would deliberately try to improve that. So for example, the judge could be like, I just didn't think that you were very clear. So I would write down like clarity. And then I would try very deliberately during my speech to be very clear. And I think that helps you practice. The other thing that I think is very helpful to have in terms of having a prep time sheet is just having sort of like, kind of like ideas for arguments. So I would have like, what do I need to prove and what are big things that need to be discussed? But other things that you can do is have, for example, like common argument types. So you could have like, is this more good than bad? Or like, does this create a harm? Is this not the responsibility of this actor? Is this immoral? So if sometimes you struggle with coming up with content, you can just kind of like go through that checklist. So I think that's also a helpful thing to have as your prep time sheet. Or those are two things that I would recommend. Do you have any ideas on how to practice this stuff? Like, how do I come up with answers to burdens of proof or well-explained impacts in the long run? Yeah, so I think that in terms of practicing analysis, obviously people or other people think that it's kind of hard, right? Like, it's a common sort of, how do I come up with analysis if I'm not like in an actual debate? But I think that there's two things that you can do. You actually don't need anything to do a prime minister speech. You don't. It is, I think, the most basic speech in BP that I think everyone should be able, like every good speaker should be able to give a solid prime minister speech. Like, I normally deputy, but I think I'm very good at prime minister as well. And I think most very good speakers are also very good at prime minister because it's a very basic analysis debate. So I think what I would recommend to practice your analysis is to just like look at a motion and then try and prep it. And then you can give the speech, but you actually don't have to, because as I said, I think that the main benefit or a lot of the benefits of analysis come up in prep time. And then try and improve on that analysis. I think that another helpful thing to do if you're trying to compare is like the HWS round robin usually has very good speakers. So I think that a very good thing to do is to just like, you prep a case and then watch the prime minister for that speech, for that debate. And then you're like, okay, what are the things that they said that I didn't have? Like, what are the differences? How could I have made my argument better? So you can have a like direct point of comparison. Another thing that is like important in terms of, or another thing that you can do is also like do the opposite, right? You watch the prime minister's speech and then you try to respond to them. And then you watch what the leader of opposition did as a response. And I think that's also a useful thing. And again, it doesn't, obviously it's better if you can do it as a society, like amongst yourselves, but I think it's also something that you can do on your own. Like allegedly MDG, who's obviously a very good speaker, that's what he did. He like woke up and he did one prime minister speech every day. So I think just like that's the easiest and the best way to practice this stuff, to just come up with a motion, prep it, and deliberately try to practice your argument structure whilst prepping that motion. And eventually it just becomes much more second nature. You immediately see a debate and you're like, yeah, this is the argument that we need. I've thought about it before. So yeah, I think that's the easiest way, or the best way rather.
Thank you.
The role of POIs in coming up with analysis. I do have a hard time at some point coming up with arguments out of pure brainstorm. I find it easier to come up with constructive rebuttal. Yeah, that's fine. Can I try to introduce them with POIs? Should I be trying to induce some kind of response to my POIs early on in the debate? If so, what am I looking for with POIs in general? Yeah, so POIs, I love POIs. I think they're great. I'm so excited that you're asking about them because a lot of people don't do them, and I think they're very important and like a really fun part of BP. I think that overall, if you're a top half team and you get a POI in from the other top half team, like POI strategy changes depending on where you are. So if you're a top half team and another top half team takes, so if you're OG and OO takes your POI, it doesn't matter if you're like revealing your arguments because they already know your arguments. They already have time to respond to them. So you want to do is like wreck their arguments. That's your main objective with that POI. Or alternatively, give them like a trick question that is gonna like trap them into some constructive trap. Conversely, if a bottom half team comes up with your PO, takes your POI, what you also want to either destroy their extension, because then your material sounds better, or alternatively, bring up your material against their own argument. Obviously, that gives them an opportunity to respond to it as well, but that's not bad. It just means they're engaging. So I think that if you're a top half, basically your main goal is to bring back your content if you're POIing a closing team, and to destroy the other side in both cases. If you're a closing, I think this changes. If you're closing, I would say don't give out your arguments in POIs. This is really important because you're CG and you give a really good POI. Maybe the opening government team would be like, that's a really good argument. Run that in deputy, and then you don't have an extension anymore. So just be really careful with essentially giving people a preview of what you're planning on running. Equally, if you think this is like a super strong response, maybe save it at least. And then if you get a POI against closing, then again, it doesn't really matter. So I think that instead what you want to be doing as a closing POIing is giving sort of like responses to the other side, but you don't want to be giving like refutation that could essentially be an entire argument. So I think that's what you want to do with POIs. Obviously, you always, with POIs, you want to engage basically with a diagonal, like the team that doesn't really interact with you that much. So again, I think the main job of POIs is like try to poke holes in the arguments, but do it without previewing. I also think that, you know, if you're not that good at coming up with arguments in brainstorm or like a constructive material, that's completely fine, because there's two sides of the same coin, right? Like you can be really good at coming up with rebuttal, and that just makes you a very good second speaker. That's completely fine. For rebuttal, what would you recommend to practice? So I think for rebuttal, the main thing that I think that the thing that I mentioned earlier, I think is a good tip. The sort of like watch a HWS round robin speech, or like any debate that's recorded, and that's like a good standard debate, like any out round at a competition, any final. Watch what the PM runs, then try to come up with like what you would say, and then compare it against what the actual speaker in the round said. So I think that's a good thing to sort of get into the habit of doing. I think that the other thing that's kind of helpful is to also make sure that your rebuttal is very structured, because otherwise it becomes quite difficult to run. And the last thing is, I think that people very frequently, obviously, if you're a leader of a position or an extension speaker, you don't have that much time for responses because you want to get your material out. So it tends to be more like singy one-liners kind of deal. But if you're like a deputy or a whip speaker, a rebuttal, I think, is essentially just an argument for why it's the opposite. So I think thinking of rebuttal kind of like as arguments themselves and trying to therefore follow similar analytical structures is quite useful. So I think you can just look at like, okay, here's what the speaker in this debate ran. This is not true. 3 reasons why this is not true. So basically think of it as arguments as well, because rebuttal is constructive material. It's just that you're using it to destroy someone else's point rather than to make a point on your own. So that's probably what I would recommend in terms of responses or rebuttal.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Right, well, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to all of you.
Bernardo sent one in the chat.
How to avoid repetitive analysis in my arguments. Yeah. So I think that the best way to do it is to just be very honest with yourself. I do think it's good when you're trying to give more reasons as to why something is true. So I would say always try and force yourself to at least give 2 reasons why something is true and to explain each of them. But I do think that you also have to sometimes be honest with yourself and be like, I don't actually have 5 reasons. I just have 3. So just make sure that you're like looking at your sheet and being honest and being like, I don't actually have 3 reasons. I have 2. The other thing that I think is really helpful in avoiding repetition is to have structured and clear notes. I think that the vast majority of time people are repetitive because they forget where they're going. So then you are like, so you start relying not on the plan that you have on your notes, but rather on like what you are saying. The other thing is that sometimes people repeat themselves when they think that they aren't being clear. So you like try to explain the same point over and over again, even though the judge already got it, but you're like, what if they didn't get it? I think that the way to solve both of these problems is to just make sure that you have a very clear notes essentially. Because if you have like your 3 bullet points, then you don't have to always go like, where was I? Let's go back. Instead, you're like, okay, thesis, reason 1, reason 2, reason 3, conclusion. And it's all very like clear. You don't have to repeat yourself because you know where you're going. And for the second one, I think also having a clear structure gives you more confidence in that what you're saying is gonna, land. But importantly, I think for the other one, it's also just like, be confident that the first time that you explain a thing, it's gonna stick. Because if you try to continue to explain it, it's just gonna be repetitive. But yeah, I think that the main way to avoid repetitive analysis is essentially, firstly, be very honest about whether or not you're being repetitive. So make sure to scrutinize your own stuff. Second, have very clear notes, because most repetition isn't deliberate, it's accidental by you mumbling. And the last one is make sure that you're confident that, the first time you said it, they did get it, it's fine.
So I guess that's it. So thanks for coming. It was really nice for you to come here. And
thank you so much
really
for having me. I really enjoyed meeting all of you, though you had great questions, and I look forward to seeing you at different competitions, hopefully.